Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to the State of the Monarch Conservation webinar. We're super excited to have you here. Today's webinar is presented by the Monarch Joint Venture's Executive Director, Wendy Caldwell. My name is Alyssa Taylor. I'm a program coordinator with the Monarch Joint Venture, and I work with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Safe Monarch program. So I'll be here to help moderate, help you with any tech issues on the back end if you're having any. And we're also joined on the back end with Jenna Tots, who is our education coordinator with the Monarch Joint Venture as well. So if you're having any problems, we can help you troubleshoot those throughout the webinar today. Before we get started, I do want to just kind of go over a few things for you. During the webinar, please put your questions in the Q&A box. So that's going to be found at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be collecting questions throughout the session today, so please go ahead and use that. You also have the option to upvote questions, so you'll see a little thumb mark next to some of those questions. So if it's a question that you're interested in as well, as this, instead of writing another one over, you just click that little thumb, it'll bump it up to the top. So questions that you might be interested that others are interested in, well, use that upvote button. You can also use the reactions during this presentation. So again, down at the bottom, the speaker will be able to see those. So if you have the chance to use those, please feel free. It is a webinar, so we can't see you all on the screen today, but it's really great to be able to interact with you kind of using those reactions. So please feel free to use those as well. As a side note, this webinar is going to be recorded and it's going to be posted to the Monarch Joint Venture website. So if you are only here for a little bit and you have to pop off at the end, please don't worry, you'll be able to access that. And as a side note, we also have an entire Monarch Conservation webinar series archives that is free and available to watch. So if you get on there and you found a topic that's super interesting, please feel free to explore any of the webinars or any of the resources on the website as well. So keep that in mind also. Last thing, if you're joining us but didn't get a chance to pre-register today, we'd love to count you and we'd love to include you in our follow-up email. So any resources that we want to touch base with you on or provide to you afterwards, we want to make sure that you get those. And if we have a chance to answer any of the additional Q&A that may have come in that we don't have the option to answer today, we'll make sure that we get that in the follow-up as well. So what I'd like you to do is email learn@monarchjointventure.org with your name and your email address, and then we'll add you to that follow-up email. So just keep that in mind as well. And then Jenna will have dropped that into the chat if you need to email it. And then last but not least, I'm going to get out of the way here so that you can hear from the speaker this evening. I'm going to introduce Wendy, our presenter. We're delighted to have her. She's going to be sharing her wealth of knowledge with us this evening. So a little bit about Wendy, from helping draft the North American Monarch Conservation Plan to coordinating community science, teaching teachers, and supporting monarch research, Wendy has built an extensive background in monarch conservation over the last 15 years. In growing the partnership to over 100 organizations today, Wendy has led the MJV through many transitions as the partnership diversified, staff grew, and the organization transitioned from a university program to become the standalone nonprofit that it is today. Through 2018, the university fostered MJV's growth and development, enabling it to embark on a new path to where we are as a thriving nonprofit entity. Growing up on a farm in West Central Minnesota, Wendy understands the value of hard work and perseverance. While pursuing degrees in environmental science and entomology at the University of Minnesota, she worked as a program coordinator for several initiatives at the university's Monarch Lab. While she worked directly on monarch conservation in some capacity since 2007, Wendy has broader conservation and research experience through positions that she held with the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, and the Illinois Natural History Survey. And aside from all of those things, she also enjoys spending time outdoors with her family, doing basically anything: sports, hiking, kayaking, gardening, invasive species removal, bird watching, and I'm sure much, much more. So thank you so much for joining us. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Wendy and stop sharing my screen. Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, Alyssa. Are you hearing an echo? Okay, great. Good evening. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm excited to share the state of monarch conservation, which I have decided is a very daunting topic. There's so much going on in the monarch conservation space that it's difficult to convey it all in a comprehensive way. So my goal tonight is to share more about how monarchs are doing and what we're doing to protect them nationwide. Starting with just some basics on monarch biology and migration, just to get us all grounded here in monarchs, the species that we're trying to protect. So as we know, as many of you likely know, monarchs undergo complete metamorphosis. So they go through these 4 distinct life stages, starting as an egg, turning into a caterpillar and going through 5 different caterpillar instar stages before they molt their skin one final time to reveal that beautiful green chrysalis that then yields itself to the adult butterfly. In the middle of this photo, central to this equation, is of course their milkweed host plants. So without milkweeds, of which there are over 100 species of milkweeds across North America, but without these milkweed host plants, we wouldn't have our beloved monarch butterfly. To talk a little bit about the migration, currently we're experiencing, or we're in the fall migration. So this phenomenon is where monarchs are traveling up to 3,000 miles to their overwintering grounds, where so east of the Rocky Mountains, we call this the eastern population. These monarchs are moving from this broad orange band, migrating all in one generation to central Mexico, whereas those monarchs west of the Rocky Mountains are primarily migrating to overwintering sites along the coast of California. We start to see this migratory behavior happening starting around mid-August, and then the butterflies are reaching their overwintering destinations in Mexico right around the 1st of November, perhaps a little bit sooner in the west at those overwintering groves in California. You can see in the photo, monarchs are roosting during this fall migration, so where they're not necessarily in search of milkweeds, they're delaying their reproduction. They're out there looking for nectar resources and roosting in trees and other plants as they're migrating south in these clusters that grow larger and larger as they move towards their overwintering grounds. At these overwintering grounds, they're looking at, or they're looking for these very particular climate conditions. And so the conditions, these monarchs that have nourished themselves during migration have stored up these fat reserves to survive the winter without a lot of food support. So while there are some nectar resources available in these overwintering groves in Mexico, it's infeasible for there to be enough to sustain millions of butterflies clustering in one small area. So they're relying on the reserves that they've gained during that fall migration to survive the winter in Mexico. This generation lives up to 9 months. We also see behaviors in Mexico. They're nourishing themselves by visiting water streams or different water sources in the mountains in Mexico. Sometimes they'll come off of the trees in beautiful clouds in the sky, or to sun themselves on the trees. We start to see mating behavior in the spring as monarchs are, you'll start to see that more and more mating behavior as they're getting ready to depart these overwintering locations. In Mexico, there are up to probably about 15 different monarch colonies that occupy different mountainsides in Mexico. Along the California coast, there are hundreds of much smaller sites. So the Mexico overwintering sites are much larger with regard to number of butterflies than those sites in California that are many. So these same monarchs that have spent the winter there, live up to 9 months, they're going to be the generation that also starts the journey back north or inland in the spring. And so starting around early March, these butterflies will start to leave their overwintering colonies in search of milkweed to lay their eggs on, lay that first generation of the year. They'll make it as far, the eastern population will make it as far as the southern US, where they'll lay their eggs on milkweeds, and then those eggs will grow to adults that then continue the journey northward in the spring. So this is a 2-step migration north, whereas that fall generation, remember, was one generation south. So we see monarchs reach that next generation that's moving north to the northern parts of their range usually makes it to the northernmost part of the range by the first week or so of June. And all in all, we see 4 to 5 generations of monarchs in any given year. How are monarchs doing? So here's the eastern population chart graphed through time. So you can see that we've been measuring this population. Our colleagues in Mexico have been measuring this population consistently since the early to mid 1990s. There have been numbers before then, but this is the most consistent measurement protocol that we've had. And what it's measuring is the area occupied by the monarchs at their overwintering sites in Mexico, the area of the trees that the butterflies are occupying. So 18 hectares is the population, the highest population ever recorded. We estimate about 20 or so million butterflies per hectare. And so you can see some natural ups and downs in this population, but through time, there's a clear downward trajectory in this eastern population size, reaching very direly low populations in the 2013 to 2014 overwintering season, which is the record low population size of 0.67 hectares. Last year, we were above the record low, but not by much. And so this population is still reaching vulnerably low levels. Our goal is to sustain this population at or above 6 hectares of area occupied in Mexico. And to do that, we've done our research community has done some modeling. Certainly there's protection of overwintering sites, but across the breeding range, our goal is to add 1.3 billion or more milkweed stems to the landscape. And of course, those milkweeds are embedded within a diverse nectar plant habitat as well. In the West, you can see similar decline over time, to the extent that in 2020, we saw fewer than 2,000 butterflies overwintering along the coast of California. While the population thankfully recovered and showed its resiliency after that all-time low, it still continues to hover at this vulnerably low population size. So where we're at between 200 to 300,000 butterflies in Mexico, we'd like to see this population get to at least 500,000 butterflies, again, protecting that breeding and overwintering habitat in the West. The blue line you see represented here actually represents the number of sites monitored. So you can see that even as we were increasing the number of sites that were being monitored in California, there was no associated increase in the monarchs being observed there. So that's an important factor that we should consider in this population as well. Digging into some of the complicated science, I wanted to present this quasi-extinction risk. So this is a paper, the Monarch Conservation Science Partnership, with many researchers involved in monarch conservation through time, have put together a variety of different population models and demographic models, different ways of modeling the population and its habitat to figure out how do we go about best protecting it. One of the important research milestones is this quasi-extinction risk. And what is quasi-extinction, do you ask? So this is when the population falls below the point where it's likely to recover. So it's not completely gone, but it's so vulnerably low that we're not sure if it's going to be able to sustain itself moving forward. And so in this particular research, I also wanted to point out that the research looks at the risk of losing the migratory phenomenon, not necessarily monarchs as a species. So without going through every number here, essentially what these researchers did is look at different thresholds of the population size and projected what is the likelihood in the next 10 or 20 years that we would reach that low of a population. to give you some context, the kind of top gray bar is the hectares. These are all lower numbers than we've ever seen before. So realistically, if we look at the 0.25 hectare threshold, the across the bottom, you can see a little bit for context. What does that mean? That's about 25 trees in Mexico. And these percentages show that we have 42% chance of reaching that population size over the next 10 years, or 62% chance over the next 20 years. So these are important figures for us to, we don't want monarchs to ever reach these lower thresholds. So we need to do everything that we can to protect them from that and act now. In the West, similar research has been done. So you can see on the bottom here, that lower threshold for risk of loss of the migration is 20,000 to 40,000 monarch butterflies. So low that we've already seen this lower threshold with the 2000, the year where we saw less than 2,000 monarchs along the California coast. So there's a high likelihood, 50 to 75% chance within the next 20 years that we will see this Western population reach that threshold again. So some things have changed that we also, Wayne Thogmartin took another look at this quasi-extinction model. And so what he did was look again at the data with new information, with a new lens. He looked at the data after 2006. And so the data being the monarch population size and some other variables. So this timestamp is important because around 2006 is the time at which this loss of agricultural habitat loss leveled off. So where we saw adoption of herbicide tolerant crops was pretty saturated at that point in time. So we were no longer losing as much habitat to this agricultural practice as pre-2006. So if that habitat loss leveled off, then we could also look differently at adult butterfly counts. So he also replaced what in the original model was egg production data with adult butterfly counts. And that the reasoning for that, without getting too much into it, is that when your habitat loss plateaued or leveled off, then you weren't necessarily, you could look at the changes in those butterfly counts after that. Whereas if we were actively losing habitat, that could mean that you're, have the same number of butterflies, but if there's less and less habitat available, the same number of butterflies might be moving to those habitats. And you can't necessarily assume that it's because the habitat was lost. They just might be moving all to the habitat that's available to them. So all this to say, he reran the numbers, looked at it with new information, and continues to model that the population is declining, continuing to experience this decline. These numbers represented below are the rate of decline. So anything less than 1 would mean the population is declining. So we went from, in 2015, 94% to today, or in 2023, 88. So that was hard science. I also wanted to point out several tools that you all have at home that researchers are using just the same to track monarchs in real time, what's happening. And we get a lot of questions about how are monarchs doing right now. And these are all the tools that we're using to try to give you some assessment of where and when monarchs are and what they're doing and how their numbers are compared to the year before or historically. And so there are programs like this. This program in particular is Journey North, where volunteers from across the Monarch Range are reporting monarchs, and those reports, it might be a milkweed, it might be an adult monarch. This particular map is fall roosts. And so we're seeing these reports coming in from across the country where a fall roost is observed and we can see the migration unfolding in real time. We can see this in the spring and in the fall. It also helps us to, there have been a lot of questions, of course, around the recent hurricanes that we've been experiencing in the southeast. How do those affect monarchs? This is a great tool for us to kind of observe how those observations are changing. And of course, it may mean that people aren't able to report, but sometimes there are very clear trends in monarchs moving around a major storm system or disappearing from that region. And so the more reports we have, the more we can observe those kinds of trends in different extreme weather conditions. In the West, the Xerces Society has a program called the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. So similarly, people are out there reporting these observations of milkweeds and monarchs. Our friends in Canada, Mission Monarch, also has a similar map of these sightings. So the way these data can be useful to you, right? If you're looking for where are monarchs being sighted in my area, are they here yet? Are people seeing roosts? So you can use programs like this to really start to get a sense for what monarchs are doing in your area and what are other people seeing. In Mexico, this Correo Real, this is their iNaturalist page. So this is showcasing a project just for Correo Real in Mexico, but you can also use iNaturalist across the Monarch range. It's a pretty universal observation reporting tool. Another project that gets a little bit more in depth that can help you understand what monarchs are doing in your area at any given time is the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. So this project is where volunteers are have adopted at least one site with milkweed habitat, and they're going out to those same milkweed plants week after week and reporting what stages of eggs and caterpillars they are finding. And so you can see this on a site-by-site basis or on a whole state basis. How are the numbers of eggs and caterpillars I'm finding comparing to other states, other regions, other sites in my area? So this is a really rich data set as well. If you're really looking to dig into what eggs and caterpillars are people finding across the range. Moving into some of the threats that monarchs are facing, of course, natural enemies are an important component in the monarch cycle. And so it's estimated that less than 5%, perhaps well less than 5% of monarch eggs that are laid will actually reach adulthood. And so these monarchs that are laying 300 to 500 eggs in their lifetime are built for this type of ecosystem environment where inevitably they are often prey to something else. But this isn't just invertebrate predators. There are bird predators in Mexico that have evolved to tolerate or avoid the toxins that monarchs have in their bodies from consuming the milkweed. There are parasites and parasitoids. So the protozoan parasite that affects monarchs is often not fatal, but important in the dynamics of the population. Kind of digging specifically into that protozoan parasite, just to give you an example, there's a program called Project Monarch Health, where volunteers sample these butterflies, the scales on the abdomen of these butterflies across the range, and send it to the University of Georgia, where they're observed and scored for their OE infection rates. And so you can see where this is significant is we see this, how OE is tracked and prevalent in different regions. It's important because a monarch infected with OE has poorer fitness and they're unlikely to complete their migration. So it's called migratory culling, where an infected butterfly will actually attempt a migration but may not survive. So by the time they reach their overwintering destinations, there are very few infected butterflies left, keeping the parasite in check. Where it gets a little problematic, you can see in the southeast, where we're seeing higher numbers of OE, higher prevalence of OE than we'd like. And that's largely due to these non-migratory populations are often highly infected with OE. And along the Gulf Coast, we see a lot of winter breeding activity that is correlated with the presence of the non-native tropical milkweed that in this environment can grow year round. And where we see this year round breeding activity, we see higher levels of the OE parasite. And that has implications for migration. So we know that these monarchs aren't as fit, aren't able to migrate successfully. And they're also right in that exchange zone where they're interacting with migratory monarchs. The loss of habitat is, of course, a big threat, where we've dramatically transformed the landscape for development, wall to wall agriculture in areas. It's certainly not an ideal environment for these insects and other wildlife species that are traversing across the landscape. So not only have we lost this habitat, but it's often degraded and fragmented, making it harder and harder for monarchs. Really ultimately, we want more habitat out there, but a lot of our goals are around increasing how often and how much habitat monarchs are encountering as they move across the landscape. The more we can help them encounter habitat, the more likely they are to lay eggs, produce offspring, and grow the population. We've been talking a lot about extreme weather lately with the situation, the hurricanes that have recently impacted a lot of lives. But extreme weather has effects on monarchs as well. So whether it's record-breaking heat waves, drought conditions, severe winter storms in their overwintering sites in Mexico. There are a lot of different factors of extreme weather that we have to pay attention to. So as these things, as with climate change, as these severe weather events are happening more frequently and with more intensity, that has much greater risk to the population. All the more reason we have to raise it to a high enough population size, a sustainable population size, so that we can be confident that with these extreme weather events, monarchs are going to be able to recover. And more, there's always more. You can see this multitude of threats that are affecting this widespread species. So from things like pesticide applications for mosquito spraying, having inadvertent effects on monarchs, to high traffic zones in areas of Texas where monarchs are migrating through in major numbers and risking vehicle collisions. All the way to our tendency as society to often prefer the manicured lawn versus native plant communities. I wanted to just go over quickly kind of the international status and protections that monarchs have. So in Canada, Canada has the Species at Risk Act. Monarchs are listed as endangered in Canada, the United States, which we're going to talk more in depth about tonight. Currently, monarchs are listed as a candidate species under our Endangered Species Act. Mexico has also several protections around the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve. So this is a federally natural protected area where monarchs are overwintering in Mexico, as well as this has been designated a World Heritage Site. They also have protections under Mexico's wildlife conservation laws as well. The International Union for Conservation of Nature did also designate monarchs as endangered and then changed that to vulnerable in the last couple of years. And historically, they actually had listed the monarch migration as an endangered phenomenon. This is not to be mistaken for endangered species listing. So while the IUCN listing is important and it doesn't necessarily come with the same regulatory authority that any of the federal listings do. In the US, just to kind of quickly review the just to quickly review kind of where we've been with the US endangered species listing process. Back in 2014, the Fish and Wildlife Service received a petition to consider listing monarchs under the Endangered Species Act. Over 2015, over the course of a few years, they gathered as much information as possible about the research and the status of monarchs as a species to put together this comprehensive report. In that, they were also looking at collecting data, collecting information from the community at large for what kinds of conservation efforts were happening. So they created a database for people to input what are these conservation efforts that you're doing or planning, so that we can use that in our evaluation. Ultimately, in 2020, the decision came that monarchs were warranted for protection under the Endangered Species Act, but precluded by higher priority actions. And so at this point in time, we're awaiting, anxiously awaiting, the December 2024 decision that if monarchs are still warranted, a proposed rule will come out this coming December. So bear with me for these next couple of slides. I wanted to talk a little bit about what does this mean and what do we know. And there's a lot of discussion happening around the Endangered Species Act. And so I'm gonna kind of carefully walk you through how we're thinking about this and where it goes from here. Starting with listing a species like the monarch butterfly is unprecedented. We haven't seen something like this before. They have a large geographic range, utilize many types of habitats. Their status as an invertebrate, interestingly, adds complications to the ESA listing. And not to mention that they are present beyond North America. So we also have some clues that in 2020, technically the decision was that they were warranted for listing, but precluded by the other higher priority actions. And if we look back at those charts, we can see that the status of monarchs in, overwintering population sizes hasn't dramatically improved since then. So in December, if still warranted, we would get this proposed ruling, which will have a lot more information for us to react to. And that essentially starts a public comment period, leading to this kind of final point here that really nothing is finalized until approximately a year after a proposed rule would come. So no regulations would take immediate effect this coming December if that proposed ruling comes out. There are a lot of important nuances, but I'm going to highlight a few here. That a monarch listing is a big deal. It's big news, but it's not new news. Listing monarchs in December wouldn't be the result of a dramatic change in the population that happened just very recently. It's still based on this careful evaluation of status of the species conducted over the last 10 years. Monarch conservation has been happening for a long time, and I've had the pleasure to be a part of that for a lot of it. So we know that we've been conserving monarchs, and we know we have more to do. So this kind of decision really just reiterates the need for more coordination and more collaboration across North America from all of these sectors. And a lot of concerns we've been hearing about are also around, how do I manage my habitat? And so I want to reiterate and I want to emphasize that increasing good quality habitat, including milkweeds, is always going to be the goal. And that habitat needs to be managed. So with something like an endangered species listing, they often have tools like a 4D rule that helps us to account for those flexibilities needed to manage habitats and to maintain them where there might be some kind of incidental take to monarchs, but really those management actions are done to maintain that habitat. This one gets a little hairy. Authority and jurisdiction is complicated. So you might not know exactly how and what the process is. So just to give you a flavor of the complications, once a species is listed under the Endangered Species Act, typically it's state agencies are then delegated authority and responsibility for protections within their boundaries of those threatened and endangered species. So interestingly, not all state wildlife agencies have authority over insects, which adds a lot of complication. Then there are other agencies that come into play to help uphold these ESA requirements, such as the Environmental Protection Agency. So there's just a lot of players involved. And in terms of who then becomes responsible for listed species and what happens next. A lot of this also, thinking about the 1,000+ species on the endangered species list, once they're listed, it doesn't necessarily mean more resources become available for listed species in general. It may just mean that the same amount of resources are available for yet more listed species. Okay, just a couple more thoughts. Because I think this is an important point. There's a lot of talk about milkweeds. Without milkweeds, we wouldn't have monarchs. Milkweeds are ubiquitous across the landscape. They occupy many types of habitat across the entire range. And so, a lot of concerns, like, it's my opinion, but part of the decision, it is very impractical and therefore, in my opinion, unlikely for milkweeds to be targeted as something that would be directly regulated. Another topic we get a lot of questions about is handling monarchs. And yes, handling monarchs could become more restricted, or it may not. And so I also just wanted to mention that if these restrictions are added, there are always tools such as scientific permits to ensure that that continuation of scientific and educational handling can occur for those purposes. There are other tools. We're partners with the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, who has worked through with the Fish and Wildlife Service a candidate conservation agreement with assurances for energy and transportation lands. That's a mouthful. It's a mechanism now called conservation benefit agreements, where you can work with the Fish and Wildlife Service as a sector, as a region, as a landowner, to help convey and provide those assurances from a regulatory standpoint that you can continue to work with conservation on your lands without being regulated, in a sense that, again, back to that management notion, we know that these habitats need to be managed, but sometimes it's going to result in taking of milkweed or monarchs. So there are a couple of parallels here that I wanted to help us think through. We know the migratory bird world has significant efforts underway. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is an important piece of legislation. But also, when we look at the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, these are major pieces of legislation where we have congressional support and infrastructure for conservation across North America, for waterfowl, for wetlands. Monarchs don't have that. Pollinators don't have that. There is some legislation. So all of our efforts to date have been voluntary. And that adds to the challenge and the complication of all of us coming together to voluntarily move this conservation forward. There are some things that could provide. There are some pieces of legislation that could provide significant resources for grasslands conservation and for wildlife conservation that I've listed here: the North American Grasslands Conservation Act, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, the Monarch Act. There are things that are in the works in attempts to provide resources for these wildlife species, for grasslands, such that we could mimic or follow suit in some of the ways that we've really increased and scaled up how we conduct waterfowl wetland management across North America. So what does this mean? Ultimately our charge remains the same. We are building this coalition of stakeholders across the Monarch Range, helping them, equipping them with the tools that they need to get more habitat on the ground, and continuing to leverage this charismatic species to be a flagship that helps us drive multiple conservation benefits forward. Um, Wayne has presented in his extinction risk model that to reduce that extinction risk by nearly half, we need to increase the carrying capacity of breeding monarchs, aka milkweed, by nearly double. I'll quickly go through. I want to make sure that we have, since my delay at the beginning, I want to make sure we have at least a few minutes for questions. So I can't talk about the incredible breadth of work that all of these organizations across North America are doing, but I can talk a little bit about the Monarch Joint Venture and our history in this space. MJV has been around since about 2008, playing a role as a leader in convening and connecting people, providing information, distilling information. Where there are gaps, we're also curating tools and resources and providing that technical guidance and expertise. So we're here to help. I'll also just kind of mention that the North American Monarch Conservation Plan is a plan for all of North America, but it was the impetus for why the Monarch Joint Venture was started, so that we could uphold the US portion of that North American plan. Our partnership, excuse me, our partnership network is about 130 plus organizations across the US. And we work with them in a lot of different capacities. We facilitate them in an annual meeting. In 2025, we're hosting a North American Monarch Summit in Minneapolis, which we're very excited about. But providing these partners tools, whether it's a grant or a networking opportunity or guidance in our Monarch Conservation Implementation Framework. So we're providing these partners the tools that they need to be effective in getting engaged in monarch conservation. Here's just kind of a visual of the breadth of organizations that are officially part of our network, and many of them are partner networks themselves. So we really do reach a lot of organizations across the country. Another pillar of our work is education. And so we look to, we have a curriculum, we do teacher professional development workshops. We offer monthly webinar series where we're drawing expertise from the various members of our network. We have a lot of downloadable materials. So really any tool you can think of to help engage communities, engage different sectors in getting involved in monarch conservation. One of the things, or I just pulled out rearing as a question we get a lot about, and our education program does a lot of handling these types of questions. So here's an example of a handout that we have: rearing monarchs, why or why not? So recognizing that raising monarchs in captivity is a powerful education tool and used in community science. We also want to be conscious of the risks and risks of disease and migratory confusion, and really ultimately help people think about this bigger context of raising monarchs to save the population isn't a sustainable conservation strategy. So we want to make sure we're balancing that effort with a shift to focusing on habitat conservation measures. And not to say that you can't raise a few monarchs for enjoyment and contribute them to citizen science and engage your community and inspire others to get involved. Just knowing the risks and making sure we're doing it responsibly. If you want to dig into more hot topics, I'll just put in a little plug for our online courses. Our Monarch Essentials course will get you into all of the hot topics. Our habitat program, we have dedicated habitat staff that support a pollinator habitat help desk where they're providing technical assistance across the country. Um, One of the ways that we're doing that is also updating a milkweed and wildflower vendor map so that we can help you quickly get to the native plant materials that you're seeking. The in California, we have a Monarchs and More Western Habitat program where we are offering milkweed plugs and wildflower seeds to landowners across the state of California. So here, with habitat, we think about a lot of different tools, but we also tools that we have to create and maintain habitat, but also thinking about different needs that monarchs have in different places. So this map we've referred to as monarch butterfly conservation units, where we're thinking about kind of core breeding habitats versus core migratory habitat, and how might our habitat management strategies change throughout that. In the science realm, to quickly highlight, I'm not going to get into a lot of the recent research, but I encourage you to. MJV does an annual research review. In the last 4 years, we've reviewed and synthesized 300 research papers captured in annual research reviews, where you can get that synopsis of what's happening in the research world. We run major monitoring programs. The Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, and more recently, we've added a remote sensing program to this. We're actively participating in the International Blitz and also leveraging these monitoring programs that we run to advance peer-reviewed publications. Just a little bit about our remote sensing, because I think it's an innovative and important tool that is going to continue to help monarch conservation moving forward. We can now fly drones over habitat. We have 2 different machine learning models where we can fly a drone over the habitat, take images, and detect detect and count common milkweed stems. We can characterize the vegetative cover, so what's grass versus flowers versus broadleaf plants, what's in bare soil. So there are these important ways we can measure and quantify the value of habitat in a much more efficient way. So, kind of skipping to the bottom point here, we can do a survey with our drone at 2 minutes per acre, whereas if we were sending a team out to do a monitoring survey, a field monitoring survey, that would take about 40 minutes per acre. And often we're doing more than an acre at a time. This is just a quick fun update that we had the chance to embody our mission by acquiring a new campus this year. So MJV has a 20-acre farm and nature campus in Minnesota, which has been an incredible opportunity for us to be the landowner and embody our mission and turn it into a hub for demonstration and education for the community and for our partners nationwide. So closing out, and I will stay late for anyone who wants to have questions. What can you do? These are kind of we're going to continue on the same trajectory. The more we can plant, improve, connect, and protect habitat, monarchs are going to be much better off. We need your help participating in community science, strengthen numbers, help us report those observations, and when and where monarchs are. The more you report, the more insights we gain. Tell others about monarchs and about MJV. Advocate for some of that important legislation, or maybe it's in your community on getting milkweeds off the HOA weeds list. And then last but not least, our efforts are made possible with support from generous donors and funders. And so we encourage you to support conservation financially and getting involved in any ways that you can. Just a couple pointers, because we all want good habitat. These are kind of the criteria we're looking for. Continuous bloom throughout the growing season, high plant diversity. The more plants you have, the more insects you're going to attract, the more diversity you're going to support. Striving for native plant communities, protect these habitats from threats, and think about not just milkweed host plants, but other butterfly host plants, bee nesting sites, nectar resources. Be thinking about all of these things as you're designing your habitat, whatever size. Final plug, if you have doubts or questions, you can always email our pollinator habitat help desk. So we've reached the end. I'm happy to stay on long, and apologies again for the weird technical snafu.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you all
Uh-oh. So I
for
still, Alyssa,
you still
unfortunately
can't
have the
hear me.
question where,
So
or the situation where I cannot hear you.
all right. So I will verbally put our questions. I will verbally read some of the questions out to you, but I'm also going to put them in the chat so Wendy can read them. So to start out with, there was quite a few questions, and some of these all linked together. So for Wendy, how does climate change affect monarchs? I think that kind of leans into some of these questions about how some of these larger storms affect monarchs, how droughts in Mexico and the United States might affect monarchs. So if we could just address how climate change affects monarchs. Let me make sure she can see that.
Oh, I see. You're chatting me. How climate change affects monarchs. Perfect. Yes. So in a lot of different ways, often some direct, some indirect ways. But when we think about monarchs, think about, they need well-timed resources. And so where there's potential for issues when it comes to climate change is when extreme heat waves, droughts, severe weather affects monarchs when they're most vulnerable or when they're most in need. So if late frosts during their spring migration knock milkweeds back, or drought conditions reduce the number of nectar resources or milkweed host plants available to them, it can cause disruptions in that chain for monarch success. So a lot of it has to do with timing of the resources and the changing climate really affecting how our ability to predict what used to be better predictable resources and timing. A lot of that's shifting and becoming harder and harder to understand.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm gonna verbally talk, even though I know Wendy can't hear me, but I'm gonna keep putting these questions in the chat, and I want to say them aloud so that you folks can hear them as well. I'm gonna chat this one to Wendy, and I'm gonna add some caveats onto it. Can you elaborate on the implications of an endangered species listing and how that listing will impact interactions with other species?
Can I elaborate on the implications of endangered species listing and how this listing will impact interactions with this species? Yeah, I think, I said I made a lot of key points and interpretations in my presentation. A lot of it we won't know until the proposed ruling comes out. And so, there's a lot of conversation happening between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the broader community and various sectors. So I think there have been a lot of conversations to try to understand all of the concerns, all of the considerations around what an endangered species listing would mean for monarchs. And unfortunately, we just won't really know until that proposed ruling comes out. And I think the important thing is that there is an opportunity to respond to it and react to it with the public comment period, so that we can make sure if something doesn't feel quite right, then there's an opportunity to have a dialogue about that.
Thank you, Wendy. And I'm gonna do a follow-up to that one because I think it kind of leans into this, but how do winter breeding colonies fit into a listing decision? That's a really interesting question because winter breeding colonies are both in the US and Mexico.
How do winter breeding colonies fit into the listing decision? Well, I mean, that's an interesting topic. Um, monarchs are monarchs. They are listing the species. And so whereas like the migratory phenomenon has been the topic of other like the IUCN long ago, um, monarchs as a species are monarchs. So interestingly, like there are monarchs in Hawaii where they're not native to that region. And so in the case of a monarch listing, we could be in a position where species are um, being protected even where they're not native. And so I think same goes for winter breeding. Even if they're not historically supposed to be there, they would still fall into whatever protections the Endangered Species Act would afford.
So just having Wendy kind of
Difference between Mexico
what that might
and
mean
the
with a
US.
listing and the difference between the two colonies.
Sorry, Alyssa, I don't want to be talking over you. I can see you talking, but I don't want to talk over you. Yeah, so I think you're asking about the difference between the California overwintering sites and Mexico overwintering sites. So in Mexico, these butterflies are moving high up in relation to a listing. Okay. Yeah. So certainly a U.S. endangered species or threatened or endangered species listing would only warrant protections for the overwintering sites in California because they are in U.S. jurisdiction. So the responsibilities for Canada or Mexico continue to resort to the authority of that particular country. So Mexico remains the authority and responsible for protections in Mexico. And with regard to the overwintering locations in California, the U.S. Endangered Species Act would certainly have some considerations and provisions there.
Thank you, Wendy. And then I'm gonna follow that one up with another great question. A lot of you in the comments have been saying, oh, I kind of noticed less this year. What does that mean? So I'm gonna send this one over to Wendy. How much do the overwintering population numbers impact the population of the following year? Is this part of their annual cycle? What does that mean?
Yeah, this is a good question. So um, it's always one of the hardest questions to answer. How are monarchs doing this year? Just because we never have enough information across their breeding range to detect a meaningful trend. So if monarchs aren't being seen in your area, that doesn't mean that somebody else, some other region isn't seeing a lot of them, or even just the site next door isn't seeing monarchs. You can't necessarily assess the entire population just based on really localized observations. So we have to look at that whole picture. And then kind of the follow up to this question of is there a part of the annual life cycle that's a turning point for the population? Really, I think there's been some research around that that spring season in the South Central region, these eggs that are being laid coming out of the overwintering generations in Mexico, good conditions for that first generation of offspring set the stage for a highly productive year. So I think certainly all stages of their development are important, but it seems like in the research, a focus on that early spring migration, setting the first generation up for success is really an important annual time frame for population increase.
Thank you, Wendy. And I do just want to recognize, folks, that a lot of you sent questions in before the webinar, and we really appreciate that. There's a lot of questions in the webinar, so we've got a handful more that we'll have a few minutes to answer. I know we kind of got a little waylaid here, so I appreciate you all hanging on with us. And we will do our best to answer a lot of these questions. A lot of them are repetitive, especially when it comes down to our follow-up emails as well, and provide you with a lot of the great resources that Wendy provided in her presentation, and a lot to answer some of these questions that you have as well. So we won't leave you hanging, but I do want to give a few more minutes for a few more questions. So this is actually a really great question regarding planting native habitat, and how sometimes it can be expensive, what resources are out there that can help you plant for monarchs.
Planting native habitat can get expensive. So, I put a plug in for our pollinator habitat help desk. That resource is available to all to help navigate this question of what programs do I have available to me? Are there what pointers can you give me for where do I start asking for what resources are available? It's different by region, and so we're here to kind of help you. Yes, lawns to legumes in Minnesota, we're here to help you navigate that local. What are those local programs you might try? If it's a bigger project, what federal programs might we help you get enrolled in, or where can we help you access those cost share resources that are available to you? Or maybe it's a local seed exchange or a plant exchange where you're swapping with the garden club in your community. Yes, wild ones is perfect. And so we're here to help you navigate that if you're unfamiliar with how to look for what programs might be available to you. Give us a shout out at the Pollinator Habitat Help Desk.
Thank you to Wendy. I'm gonna throw just one or two more questions in, and I know there's a few questions in here, and I do want to address them because this can get confusing when it comes to a listing decision as well, and just kind of the differences in all of the entities that are out there and doing work in relation to monarchs. So I did just want to kind of bring this one to the forefront as well. What is the difference between vulnerable and endangered for the IUCN, and then how that relates to a decision?
What's the difference between vulnerable and endangered for IUCN? I guess I can tell you that I'm not entirely certain on the specifics of what the ranking means, but I can tell you kind of that the change from endangered to vulnerable. Certainly endangered. I guess endangered is a more severe listing than vulnerable, but the reason for that change is that the IUCN criteria are set to look at the last 10 years of the population. And so when you look at monarchs over the course of their longer term history, there's a more severe decline than what is demonstrated across just the last 10 years. So the population remains low, but it's also shown some level of stability across the last 10 years, just at a lower than historic rate. And so that was where the IUCN criteria originally kind of missed that point and changed from endangered to vulnerable, just to kind of downlist the species that way. And how it doesn't necessarily relate to US Endangered Species Act. They follow similar processes where they're looking at the status of the species, but the two don't necessarily inform. They maintain separate processes.
We'll make sure that we include a link again in this follow-up email to kind of the IUCN and how that functions and what those processes look like. But again, yeah, there's so many different entities that are looking into a lot of these populations. So a lot of different things, a lot of stuff at play, a lot of information out there. So we'll make sure that we provide you that information as well about how the IUCN works and what it means to be on their red list, and all that good stuff as well. So we're adding that into the resources that we receive. And then I do want to just I've got two more questions I'm gonna hit, and then we'll make sure that we provide you guys with any upcoming interesting things that we've got going on, and we really appreciate you hanging on. So second to last question, Gonna go back into listing. I know this is a bit confusing. So could a potential listing exclude these non-migratory populations? So some of these areas in Florida or other locations, can it exclude the non-migratory populations?
I don't think a listing would exclude any populations. I think the tricky part of invertebrates in the Endangered Species Act is that they cannot actually consider subpopulations. And so whereas other species you can list subpopulations or subspecies, but invertebrates have particular rules under the SA about that. And so really a listing includes all populations.
All right, folks. And then for the very last question, this is going to shout out to everybody and you. We're going to end with my favorite question. And I kind of hijacked the last question here, but my favorite last question, because we can all play a big role in monarch conservation and getting habitat out there on the ground. So what is your favorite milkweed species? And hopefully you guys have them planted wherever you are and wherever you're monitoring and whatever you're looking at. So to Wendy, what is your favorite milkweed?
Okay, not cutting you off, Alyssa. Sorry. Um, um, this is a good question. I think it might change frequently, but I do particularly like world milkweed.
A great choice. I hope you all are thinking about that as one of those parting pieces to the day today. I appreciate you all hanging on with us and working through some of these technical issues that we have. Again, we are going to be following up with you and providing you with a lot of these resources that Wendy put into the presentation today, hopefully answering some of these questions as we start to compile them and see what those look like. And we really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to learn about what you can do, what the state of monarch conservation is, and what is going on around the country, not with just MJV, but all of its partners and what everybody is up to working towards recovery and monarch conservation. So we thank you for all of your efforts, whether you're just starting today or you've been working towards monarch conservation for your lifetime. We appreciate everything that you do. We are all working together towards this great cause. And to keep yourself moving forward, I did want to provide to you as if you want to stay informed and you're interested for more monarch conservation webinars, we will have a webinar, our annual webinar series on Tuesday, the third Tuesday of each month at 1 p.m. Central Time. Our next webinar is actually going to be entirely in Spanish, which is amazing. So it is the Elementos Fundamentales de la Mariposa Monarca, the fundamental elements of the monarch butterfly. And that's going to be on October 22nd at 1 p.m. with Clarissa Ortega and Luis Osario. So if you would like to register for that, I'm going to go ahead and drop that link in the chat as well. So please feel free. And then last but not least, I know you're hanging on with me here, but last but not least, I do want to provide you with a link to give us your thoughts on our webinar series. And please take the time to do that and fill it out. It helps us know what everybody is interested in learning about and how we can better keep you all informed as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Wendy, so much for providing this information, and please feel free to reach out. Have a great night.